There is a species of butterfly known as the monarch butterfly, and every winter it undergoes a migration journey, and the journey is about 3,000 miles long. And the most fascinating thing about this journey is that the group of butterflies that starts the journey never makes it to the end of the journey, because it takes around 4 to 5 generations for the journey to complete. That means throughout the journey, new butterflies are born, they die, another generation is born, and so on. It takes 4 to 5 generations for the whole migration to complete. So what caught my attention here is, here we can see that how evolution and natural selection forces an organism to develop such complex characteristics, both physical and psychological characteristics, that helps them survive in the environment where they live. Now I want to bring the same logic to humans as well, since we humans are also a product of natural selection or a product of evolution. So in the same way as those monarch butterflies, we also, like every other organism, have a set of physical and psychological traits that we have inherited from our ancestors, which helped our ancestors survive in the wild, in the environment where they lived. But right now, the fact is, we do not live in those kinds of harsh conditions. We do not live in the wild anymore. So we don't need those physical traits and the psychological traits that our ancestors had. We do not need to apply those traits. We have much more civil ways to deal with situations right now. But unfortunately, those physical and mostly psychological traits I'm talking about here, they still manifest in the modern society among us. And there are people who knowingly or unknowingly manipulate and trigger your ancestral psychological traits and manipulate an individual, or manipulate the whole group. Now I just want to talk a little bit about Richard Dawkins. So Richard Dawkins contributed a lot in this field of evolutionary biology. So everybody knows his book on the selfish gene and his concept of memes and the extended phenotype. But surprisingly, even though he has contributed so much to understanding the behavior of organisms from an evolutionary perspective, explaining the behavior of organisms or the physical and psychological characteristics of organisms from an evolutionary perspective, surprisingly he refuses, or he is very reluctant to use evolutionary theory to explain human phenomena in the modern society. So this is what he has got to say. I prefer not to talk about the things that we do in the modern society in a straightforward biological way, and it often is not helpful to apply Darwinian ideas directly to the sorts of things that we get in modern society, whether it is warfare, xenophobia, etc. Now, yes, to a certain extent I do agree with what he has got to say. We should not carelessly apply evolutionary logic to human behavior. It is very harmful to apply evolutionary behavior in a careless way. But even more harmful is to not apply evolutionary theory to understand human behavior at all. So on the other end of the spectrum, there are scientists like Brett Weinstein. He is also an evolutionary theorist, and he fully supports explaining human phenomena, human behavior from an evolutionary perspective, how whatever we do has some kind of evolutionary root. He even goes on to explain how religion can possibly be a manifestation of can be explained from an evolutionary perspective. But the broad point that I'm trying to make here is that we should definitely explore or try to understand as much as possible. No, I won't say every, but as much as possible, to understand human phenomena, human behavior from an evolutionary perspective. Just let me give you an example. Let's say xenophobia. So the definition of xenophobia is fear of people of other countries. But in general, this thing is about a kind of hatred or reluctance towards accepting people of who is not similar to you. Maybe he's of other religion, other color, other country, whatever it is, other community, but you have a reluctance towards someone who is not from your group. And and there is an evolutionary benefit to it, which definitely helped our ancestors, but now it is really creating a big problem in the society, because now we have we should be having a different way to deal with these kind of situations. So in the wild, our ancestors, it really helped for them to quickly recognize someone who is not from your group, and to quickly eliminate that person or that individual. Because when you live in a group, so in the early days, the groups are quite small, around 100 to 150 people live, and each and every people had a definite role. They played a role, and they served the whole community as a whole. And so the whole community, each and every person had a role to play in the proper functioning of the community. Now if someone from outside the community comes in, and they reap the benefits while the members of the community are working, so that means their resources are being consumed by someone else who is not really putting effort into serving the community. So now it makes proper sense to be able to quickly identify those kind of person and to eliminate them, because they are stealing the resources by not contributing to it. So it made perfectly good sense to be able to recognize and eliminate those kind of people in a violent way, or whatever way was required back then. But right now it is not necessary to eliminate those kind of people in such a violent way. You can have a constructive conversation with those kind of people, and have civilized way to deal with those kind of situations. You don't have to kill them, or don't have to burn down their houses. So first of all, when we realize that why we have this kind of hatred towards someone who is of a different color, country, religion, etc. Once you know the cause, then you can self-introspect and then ask that, why is it necessary for me to hate that person, or is it necessary for me to take a violent action towards that person? And most probably you don't have to take a violent action towards those kind of people. There is definitely a civilized way to deal with those kind of situations, but you can only deal with those kind of situations in a civilized way when you realize where this violence is coming inside of you, how the traits that were passed on to you by your ancestors are manifesting in the modern world in a negative way, and that is not allowing us to reach our goal that we have set. That is, we have created values like equality, non-violence, etc. But at the same time, this genetic program that is within us, that has been passed to us by our ancestors, those genetic programs are actually not allowing us to fulfill these goals of equality and non-violence and creating a peaceful society. So I'm not saying that if you study these things from an evolutionary perspective, that these things there will be no more violence, no more war. But at least to a certain degree, people will understand and that the animal that why do they act in such inhuman ways. And once they realize that they're acting like an animal, maybe a few people will decide to act in a more civilized way. And that is why I try to explain and try to study this human behavior from an evolutionary perspective, so that I can get an insight both at an individual level, as a society as a whole, how this kind of how there are indirect manifestations of the traits of the psychological traits that were passed on to us by our ancestors.